welcome to the latest edition of Author Talks. In this edition, we have with us Robert W. Norris. He has written 5 books today, till date. And out of these 5 books, I think, Robert, if I'm correct, a couple of them are fiction and a couple of them are non-fiction works. Am I correct?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So, Robert, welcome to the show. And could you please introduce yourself?
Well, thank you very much, Onkar, for having me on your show. And I appreciate the opportunity very much. Yes, as you mentioned, I was born and raised in a small town in Northern California. And actually, that was 1951. So that makes me 72 years old now and retired, no longer teaching. So, yeah, I grew up in the 1950s and came of age in the tumultuous 1960s 's during the Vietnam War, and I was a part of that hippie generation. And the Vietnam War, of course, was at its peak when I turned 18, and so facing the draft, I decided maybe a better option was joining the Air Force, thinking that I would never have to carry a weapon. As it turned out, fate played a cruel trick on me, and I was trained as a guard for the B-52 bombers that were bombing Vietnam and dropping napalm and many other bombs. And so I was influenced heavily by maybe the beat writers and the music of the times, for example, Bob Dylan and some of his anti-war music. And there was a growing anti-war movement from within the military at that time. And eventually I got my order to go fight in the war, but I refused, and I applied for conscientious objector status, which of course was refused, and I ended up being court-martialed. And I was originally facing about 5 years in military prison, but this was my introduction to the power of language.
Okay.
When I was given my order to go fight in the war, I didn't say the word no. I just kept repeating the same sentence over and over again. If I don't feel I'm physically or mentally capable of killing another human being. And it turned out that that single sentence saved about 4.5 years of my life. I was sentenced to 6 months innocent of the original charge against me, which was called willful disobedience to a direct order. And I was guilty of a lesser military crime of negligent disobedience to a direct lawful order.
So I'm sure that had a great influence, as you mentioned, on yourself, and you were introduced to the power of language during this period. But overall, your experience as a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War and your time in prison, how did these events sort of shape up your mind, and you eventually turned out to be an author?
Well, I can't say that those experiences while I was going through them really affected me all that strongly. It was just a daily struggle to survive the environment that I was in. But once I was released from prison and returned to society, I felt a bit like the outcast. And I worked a few labor jobs, but eventually, and this is probably true of many of my generation, the hippie generation, we eventually went out into the world and tried to create our own lives and find what our futures would be, aside from just being the typical Americans of the past. And we disagreed with our government. We disagreed with our parents' generation. We were rebels in a sense. And so in 1973, I ended up hitchhiking across the United States from the West Coast to the East Coast, and then bummed around Europe for a few months. And I met a lot of young artists and painters and writers, poets from the European countries. And I was quite envious of them because most of them spoke more than one language, and they seemed to have fulfilling lives, and they were expressing themselves in a variety of ways. And I thought, I would like to do that too. I was a bit embarrassed that I could only speak English and barely that native language. And
Right.
so when I returned from that experience and hitchhiked across the states again, I had a new target. I wanted to become a writer. I was heavily influenced by the art and artistic history of Europe. And so I began studying literature and I began writing a lot of short stories about my experiences traveling and in prison. And eventually, what started out as a kind of dash eventually became a marathon, and I expanded towards maybe I should write a novel.
Mhm.
And well, I was always writing, but of course, you have to feed yourself and make a living. So I eventually became a cook, and that skill allowed me to wander across the states, and usually I was able to find a job someplace. There's a large turnover in the restaurant trade, and
I would say that's quite an experience. First you fought in the war and spent time in the prison. Then you traveled across the world, had a lot of experiences. Then you tried hands at different things, including cooking. So quite variegated kind of multifaceted experience that you have got.
well, yeah, and I came into contact with a lot of different types of people too. And
Mm,
of course, when we're younger and we're in our maybe 20s, you write about what you think you know, and your experiences are limited, and the immediate world is what you write about. And you write about, well, mainly autobiographical stuff and a lot of what young man's angst. It might be frustration with the world at large and the unfairness of everything. And so eventually I was ready to write a novel, and I returned to Europe in 1977, trying to follow the steps of Hemingway and a lot of the other expatriate writers, Henry Miller from the 1930s. And so I returned to Paris, and there I met a man from Afghanistan and another man from Iran, and
mhm.
they were staying in the same cheap hotel that I was staying in. And I helped them secure some visas and leave a couple of messages with the desk clerk. And they were so appreciative of the help that I'd given them that they invited me to come back to their countries with them. This was 1977, so the Shah was still in power. The Islamic Revolution had not happened for another year and a half or 2 years. And the Iranian told me that there were jobs for English teachers in Iran, and it would be easy to find a job. And so I said, hey, that sounds good. Paris is very expensive and my money's running out. So that began about a year-long journey, which took me completely around the world and through India as well at the tail end of that, and had a lot of adventures. I was able to see Iran, Afghanistan, never found a job teaching, but I was able to have a lot of adventures, experiences. At that time, what they called the hippie trail from
Mhm.
Europe to India and
I still
Nepal.
remember there were a lot of movies from that time. If you see the reflections of those hippie trails and the hippie cultures that was flourishing across the world at the time.
Yeah. And I traveled with the Iranian and the Afghan, so I didn't really meet a whole lot of those other hippie types, but I was lucky enough to see those countries, because now it's almost impossible to go through that part of the world, at least for a Westerner. And I gained a lot of interesting insights into life in different parts of the world. And so, yeah, once I finally ran out of money and returned to the States, I began cooking again. And finally, the influence of those experiences and all the people I met on the road and the previous experiences in Europe all kind of had a strong influence on me. And I wanted to live and work in another country. And I wanted to study a foreign language. And I thought originally,
Mhm.
maybe that's possible in Spain or someplace in Europe, but fate intervened, and I ended up in Japan in 1983. And now it's 40 years later, and I eventually was able to find a job teaching at a private university, and joined the teachers union there. And
before you tell the further story, was it easy? Was Japan welcoming enough? I mean, that you decided that this is the place where I want to settle and live my rest of life.
Yeah, 1983, that was really sort of near the beginning of Japan's economic miracle, actually, in the 1980s and early 1990s. So there was a great demand for English. Japan was becoming much more internationalized and sending out a lot of their engineers for car manufacturers and other companies who were setting up factories abroad. And so they needed people to be able to speak English. And so a lot of companies were investing money in the research and development and training for their young employees. And there were conversation schools cropping up here and there, where it was fairly easy for a Westerner you didn't really need many qualifications. All you had to do was be a native speaker, and you could find a job somewhere. And so that's how I started out, was teaching in the conversation schools there. I found the Japanese very welcoming and very interested in the outside world, and very eager to try out what English skills they had. And yeah, I never faced any kind of discrimination or any problems through those years. The biggest problem was trying to learn the language itself, and it was a bit of a culture shock. But I had no problems. I think my experiences of traveling abroad before sort of prepared me for any kind of culture shocks or how to deal with the unknown. And every day was something of an adventure. And basically, I was living my dream. I was studying a foreign language and living in another country. So every day was quite a learning experience.
Continue, please.
Yeah, so I didn't have any qualifications at that time, but I made the commitment after I met my wife. I got married, so I was committed to spend most of the rest of my life here in Japan. And so a more secure or stable job than an English conversation teacher's job was to, if possible, hook on at a university, but you need to have a minimum of a master's degree to do that. So I was able to find a correspondence course, and while I was working a variety of different jobs, teaching English conversation and teaching some company classes as well, it took about 7 years, but I eventually got my master's degree in teaching of English as a foreign and second language. And once I got that, I was able to find a part-time job at a women's junior college, teaching once a week, in addition to several other part-time jobs. And eventually a position for a full-time foreign teacher opened up, and I applied for that job and was lucky enough. By then, my Japanese had improved enough that I was able to pass the interview, which was in Japanese. And so aside from the classroom, almost all the work I had to do, as a member of different committees and administrative type responsibilities, all had to be done in Japanese. So I was studying Japanese all this time too, intensively. And fortunately,
just coming to your writing, Robert, you have written nearly about 5 books, and just could you please tell us about the books that you have written, fiction, non-fiction, all of it, and how was your writing actually influenced through your experiences and the life journey that you just narrated? How is it, reflecting in all your works?
Yeah, that's a good question. I had, by the time I got my job at the women's junior college
Uh-huh.
as a full-time, not professor by then, that came later. I was just a lecturer at that stage. This was in 1992.
Mm-hmm.
And by then I had written probably 3 or 4 drafts of a novel and had sent it off to different American publishers, but
Mm-hmm.
it had always been rejected. And I think what I lacked was experience and style and detailed knowledge of grammar and many other facets, but the learning of the Japanese language caused me to focus a lot on grammar and to learn my own language
Mm-hmm.
uh, in detail a lot more than I had known before. And so, and plus the discipline of writing so many academic papers toward, different coursework towards your final thesis over the years, uh, that gave me a lot of uh, useful skills, I think. Just the discipline, style, how to structure different scenes and getting away from, well, just the logic of writing. And so I was able to use that skill in rewriting my fiction. And I eventually was able to get that published by an independent Japanese publisher. Anyway, the first novel was called Looking for the Summer, and it was quite autobiographical. And it's a novel about a former Vietnam conscientious objector's search for identity in Europe and Afghanistan, Iran, and India. And that was followed up a couple of years later by a second novel called Toraware, which is the Japanese word for obsession.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a novel of the relationship of 3 young misfits from different cultural backgrounds in Kobe in the
I can
1980s.
clearly see where it's coming from, your travels and experiences that
Very
made you into
autobiographical,
writing. Yes.
but highly dramatized here and there.
I can vouch that.
Yeah. And then I also was able to find a different Japanese publisher. I was introduced to that publisher by a colleague, Japanese colleague, uh, and it became a novella,
Mhm.
again, based on my own personal experiences. So many people had asked me by that time, why did you come to Japan? How did you come to Japan? And so rather than sit down over 2 or 3 beers and try to explain the whole story, I just wrote it down in very simple English, and that was turned into a textbook for Japanese universities. And I added a lot of discussion and comprehension questions at the end of each chapter, and that did fairly well. Then a third novel was based on a trip I took with my wife back to Europe to kind of retrace my roots of how I came to Japan. I wanted to show her the places I'd been influenced by in Europe, especially. And that was around the year 2000 or so. But that was kind of an hallucinogenic midlife crisis adventure story, and a homage to a couple of my favorite writers. One was named Malcolm Lowry,
Mhm.
who was from England, but actually became an expatriate in Canada, and Canada claims him as one of their great writers. And then another one of my favorites was Herman Hesse, who influenced me
Mhm.
a lot during my hippie days.
Great writer,
And
of course.
yeah. And so what's that? Let's see, that was called Autumn Shadows in August, Torawade, Looking for the Summer. Oh, the novella textbook was called The Many Roads to Japan.
Mhm.
And all those were published by smaller independent publishers in the 1990s and early 2000s. And all of those publishers eventually went bankrupt. And
Oh, I
to
can
use it,
understand because even recent times, if you see, uh, publishing is one of the worst hit domains, and the interest that people used to have in books back maybe 15 years back or so no longer exists. So,
yeah.
and the cost of printed books have gone significantly high. People sometimes think that it's better to read a digital edition rather than a print one. So, a lot of reasons, I would say.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because all the rights were returned to me by those publishers around the year 2005 or so. And that was right at the beginning of this ebook phenomenon.
Mhm.
And I did a little bit of research on that. And I thought, well, I have all the rights now. I can keep these books alive through the print on demand technology. And at that time, ebooks were put out in CD form. and,
I know.
and yeah, the very first few, but I was able to get those books out on that market early on. They never really sold much at all, but I kept the books alive. And I became so busy at that time that I was eventually promoted to professor. And so all the administrative responsibilities that came along with that were so time consuming. I actually became the dean of students for a couple of years at this small university. And I couldn't do any writing at all other than academic articles that, Japan, like many countries in the academic world, has a publish or perish mentality. And
Mhm.
so you have to continually upgrade your resume and your CV. And so I was writing a lot of papers and giving a lot of presentations on the teaching of English as a foreign language. And so it was another 20 years almost before I wrote another book. I contributed to chapters to a
Mhm.
few academic publications that were translated from my English into Japanese and became part of it, like a group publication, reference material for teachers in Japan.
All right. Right.
I kept my hat in the ring, so to speak, that way. But as far as my own wants and desires, I'd always had a couple of books, in my mind that I still wanted to write. And I finally retired in 2016. And 2 or 3 years later, my mother passed away, and we had had a very, very close relationship. And so I wanted to,
So
in a
sorry
sense,
to hear that.
she was almost 95, so she had a long, fulfilling life.
Wow.
Um, but I wanted to kind of pay tribute to her life and the relationship that we had and the influence that we had on each other. She was another searcher in a sense and a very artistic soul. And
Mhm.
so I went back through all our old emails and correspondence, the regular snail mail that we had for years and years, and a couple of videos that I'd taken. And I actually had recorded some of her family stories
Mhm.
uh, through the years, and whenever I would go back to the States and visit. So I had all this material, and so I thought, well, I think I'll write a nonfiction, you
So
could say,
that's your latest book, The Good Lord
yeah,
Willing and the Creek Don't Rise.
yeah. It's a long title, but yeah, it's partly my own life story, but it focuses quite heavily on her life as well in our relationship, despite the physical distance that was
Mhm.
between us, an entire ocean, but we kept very,
But
very close.
in short, if you want to, elaborate about the book in short, um, oh, what does this book really focuses on? What are the universal instances that everyone can relate to? What is in the book that way?
Well, I think everybody can relate to the love they have for their parents and the influences that you well, not just a one-way situation, the influence that you have on each other, in a sense.
Mhm.
For me, it was she had such a, I don't know, symbolic life, and she was a
Okay.
very optimistic, positive person, despite having grown up during the Depression. And
Mhm.
are you familiar with the John Steinbeck novel, The Grapes of Wrath? It was turned
I
into
have heard
a
about that.
film.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the family in that was a really poverty-stricken farming family that during the Depression lost their jobs in Oklahoma, and they migrated west to California trying to find work picking fruit. But
Mhm.
their trials and tribulations during a really economic tough time, not only in the United States, but the entire world. But her family was very similar to that family, and they migrated from the Dakotas, North and South Dakota in the United States at the same time during the Depression to the West Coast in Oregon and Washington, picking fruit along the way for very minimal amount of money, and the only way they could survive was as a family unit with everybody working and helping out and pitching in. And so her life as a child was very hard, but she was a very strong, independent woman,
Mhm.
and she always was working and always trying to improve herself. And she was a bit of a rebel as well, and an artistic type who always wrote poetry and played music. And
Mhm.
so I just remembered a very warm family environment. We didn't have very much in terms of
Yeah,
yeah,
sounds really interesting. I'm sure
but
readers will love this book, of course.
yeah, I just wanted to introduce my mother to the world in a sense, and then I think I gained a lot of strength from her, and it maybe captures a kind of
And the
slice of life.
energy that passes from mother to their children, I think that's something um, uh, that everyone can relate to. And the
Yes, yes.
story that she has been through, and the instances that you mentioned, how the Great Depression and other following events had an impact on her life, plus the decisions she took to maybe go through those situations and project herself, or maybe to steer forward in life. I think
Yeah,
all
and
this put together is pretty interesting.
she was also a very courageous woman at a time where the woman was expected to stay at home. And in the 1950s, divorce was frowned upon, to say the least. And she ended up divorcing her first husband, and then she had been very devoted to the Catholic Church and had played the organ in the church sermons on Sunday, and it was part of the choir. And she devoted a lot of her energy and time to the church. And yet, when she married again, thinking that she needed a husband to help raise her children and to provide some kind of security, financial security for the family,
Mhm.
because it was very difficult for women at that time to find jobs other than waitressing or something like that. Uh, she was kicked out of the Catholic Church. At that
Oh.
time, it was not accepted in the Catholic Church to, once you were divorced, you couldn't marry again. And so
Mm.
she was, I don't know, emotionally hurt by this experience. And
I'm
then
sure she was.
she eventually, yeah, the second marriage didn't work out, but she in her 40s uh, took classes to learn how to fly, and she got a commercial pilot's license, and for actually two
Wow.
summers
Wow.
she became a fire lookout, flying a small plane in the mountains looking to see if there's any smoke down below or any fires, and reporting that information to the
Mhm.
Forest Service, which
And
was
California is infamous for those fires.
yeah, these days really terrible. And in her 50s in the wake of her second divorce, she gained a qualification to become a legal secretary. And for the rest of her life, she continued working until she was 78 as a legal secretary. And so she had a never give up attitude and very independent. And I think I was lucky enough to inherit those traits from her. So yeah, this book is to pay tribute to her life, I think.
Fantastic book, Robert. So before we close this discussion, I would, hear from you your thoughts and maybe an advice to writers and a request to prospective readers that you wish to extend, please.
Well, yeah, it's easy to say, hard enough to actually carry out on an individual basis, but the advice of, never giving up. And there's a lot of interesting Japanese proverbs that encompass this thought or this feeling. One is called Nana Korobi Yaoki, which means to fall down 7 times, get up 8. It means basically never give up, never.
Inspiring.
Yeah, and so that, and then another one was it called Ishino Ue ni mo san nen, which is spend 3 years on the rock, which means that if you commit yourself to do something, don't give up easily. You have to commit at least 3 years to mastering something. And writing definitely falls in that category. It takes years and years and years.
Yeah, it does. And I can say that first publishing my first book was quite an experience, and the amount of rejections I went through and the changes I had to make in the draft. So the first verb that you pointed to, I think that really I can easily relate to that.
Yeah, just because you've written one draft doesn't really mean that much. That's something to be proud of, but writing is rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. And read, read a lot of different types of genres, but mainly whatever resonates with you, study that writer's style and think about, why did you react a certain way to this particular character's behavior, or how did the writer set up this scene, or what is the arc of the story, and the technical aspects, and of course grammar is important, but you have to, in a sense, copy a lot of other writers' styles and copy until you finally find your own. And that's when it
finding
becomes
your
natural.
own voice is perhaps the journey one has to take, at least the writers. Yeah. So Robert, thank you so much for being part of this discussion. Your journey is truly an inspiring one. And the latest book that you have written, I think Your Mother's Life, is going to be very inspirational for the readers. And I wish you all the luck in this book. And
thank you
we'll
very
meet
much.
again, we'll talk again.
Okay, can I add one more thing about the title?
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a rather long title. It's The Good Lord Willing and the Creek Don't Rise. And the subtitle is Pentimento Memories of Mom and Me. And the first part, The Good Lord Willing and the Creek Don't Rise, this is really an old American slang expression that there's a lot of controversy about where it comes from. Some people say it's from the Bible. Others think that there's more of a political, historical background to it. But what it basically means is if good fortune comes, if you're lucky. And it was very indicative of my mom's optimistic attitude towards life, that no matter how dark things got or how difficult a situation she found herself or her kids found themselves in. She would always say, "The good Lord willing, and the creek don't rise. We'll get through this. Good things will happen." So that was a symbolic expression that I thought was appropriate for the title. And then the Pentimento Memories comes from the title of a book by Lillian Hellman, who was a playwright and a memoirist who wrote mainly in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And she was a political activist as well, and was called to testify in the sort of the communist witch hunt days of the 1950s by the Joseph McCarthy Senate committee. They were called the House Un-American Activities Committee. And she became somewhat infamous for that. And that committee was responsible for sending a lot of artists and creative sort of left-wing creative people to jail. And it was a strange time in American history.
I think
at any rate,
recently there was a movie on this subject. A lot of
there have been quite a few.
Yeah, one author, I think that a screenplay writer, he was jailed, and when
Dashiell
Kennedy
Hammett.
became the president, then all of the charges were removed, and everything was stopped. Yeah, I don't
that was
remember the title, but
tough time. Well, she was in the middle of all that. And later on in her life, as she was reflecting back on these experiences, she wrote a series of memoirs, and one of them was called Pentimento. And she used the term, well, pentimento is a term used in art and painting, that when an artist paints a scene and then kind of reflects and repents in a sense, and changes his view of that scene and paints over it, that's called pentimento. And she used the word pentimento as a metaphor for memory, of how our memory changes. And so I thought, when I was going through all these old letters and tapes and everything with my mother.
Robert, just to interrupt you, this call will end in 30 seconds, I believe.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I thought it was appropriate. So Pentimento Memories of Mom and Me. So thank you very much,
Thank you so much for being part of this discussion. We will connect again. And I wish you all the luck for your book. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.